Who the hell can wait till morning? Talk now at latenightsportsradio.com.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, it's Late Night Sports Radio. I'm your host, Jim Sarentius, and welcome to the FantasyGreek.com's NFL Football Power Hour. I am Joyce, joined by our producer from 87sportsfans.com, the illustrious, not to be outdone by anybody, and I'm talking about you, Dan Patrick, the one, the only, Keith Grieve. Keith, how's it going?
Great. There you go again, like picking fights with Dan Patrick in my name.
Oh, if you don't want me to, I don't have to. But I think that when Dan Patrick wakes up in the morning, he leans over, looks at that black and white photograph he has of you on his mirror in his bathroom and says, "Today I'm going to outdo you, Keith Grieve." Is there any problem with that?
Well, doesn't everybody? I mean.
Well, I try to live up to the example that you lead. Keith, how's that?
Right, and I gracefully lower the bar every week.
And for a guy like me at my height and weight, that's a good thing. Anyway, tonight we are going to talk about two teams, ladies and gentlemen, the Cincinnati Bengals and the Jacksonville Jaguars. And the first part of our show, we'll talk Bengals with Dan Klaskins of XM Sirius Radio, of Fox Sports, of ESPN. And in the second half, we'll be joined by FantasyGreek.com contributor Ahmad Alawi, who covers the Jacksonville Jaguars for us. It should be a great show. Both have a lot to say. They're both certainly outspoken individuals, and we look forward to all the enlightenment we can get, especially from Dan, who does a little fantasy football on the side, and we can talk about that more when it comes on. In any case, just a reminder to you, if you're listening live and you have any questions or comments, feel free to give us a call at 585-633-7487. That's 585-633-7487. Or you can get on Twitter and tweet the Greek at hashtag AskTFG. That's hashtag AskTFG. And remember, there is no such thing as a stupid question. So, Keith's ready. I'm ready. Our guests are ready. It's time to introduce our first guest, Mr. Dan Klaskins, radio host on Sirius XM Fantasy Sports Radio, ESPN 1530, and what I know him more for, Fox Sports 1360. Dan, hello and welcome to the show.
How we doing, Jim? As I said before, happy off season to you. It's never really an off season for guys like us, and luckily we have the draft coming up and plenty of free agent moves still in the rear view mirror here. It's been a pretty exciting couple months since we last saw some football.
It really has, Dan, and I think so much of it has to do with just the change in sort of the dynamics of some of the different positions that used to be just, you knew half the teams in the league had their workhorse running back, and now it's harder to guess at that. And sort of the tide switches. You have one team copying another team, and then teams say, you know what, I think we do need a good running back this year. Let's go draft one.
Oh, and the running backs this year, certainly one of the positions that are loaded. But everybody's indispensable. You're looking at a league, the NFL, full parity. It's exactly what they wanted when they put us through the salary cap system and era that it is. The reality of it is you have 32 teams, and realistically, looking at the season right now, 24 of them could end up playing in the Super Bowl if we were to sit here and go through the winners today. I mean, that could be a bit of a stretch. Certainly, nearly every team out there with some playoff aspirations, and I think that's what's made it fun. But at the end of the day, it's also from the perspective of the Bengals in particularly here. I mean, without those playoff wins, it's getting a little frustrating. But, I mean, the fact that they've been able to put together, 3 straight double-digit seasons here of victory totals, a pretty impressive feat in its own right.
Indeed it is, Dan, and that's why we brought you on the show to talk about the Bengals, and I want to get down to business with them. You mentioned the 3 seasons with double-digit wins, but I think it's 4 seasons that they've made the playoffs, but they've been one and done in each of them. And, in the way I've been doing this now for a little over 4 years, in the way the Bengals sort of have grown on me is in the way that they're really one of the more conservative franchises in the league. They have a stout owner in Mike Brown who doesn't like to throw the money around. They obviously have a great head coach in Marv Lewis. They seem to be one of these teams that believe in draft and develop. They like to re-sign their own guys. But in terms of the overall picture, I guess, because you're a Cincinnatian, tell me a little bit about what you would know from just physically being there as to the ownership and the coaches.
Well, I mean, it all starts at the top, as it does with any organization, Jim. And there's no doubt that Paul Brown was a founder of football and one of the innovators early of the game. And when he stepped down from the team, after their Super Bowl 23 appearance all the way back in January of '89, Mike Brown stepped in there, nearly 25 years ago, and early on, it was very much a power struggle for him, trying to fill into his father's legacy. There's no doubt that at times he's been called cheap. I mean, some businessmen might call him smart. And through his first half of his quarter of a century as the leader of this organization, the guy at the top of it, I mean, the results spoke for themselves. I mean, the Bengals of the 90s, one of the worst decades in all of professional sports, making a team like the Raiders and what they've been through the last decade look like nothing. And but now that said, the second half of his tenure, most of that time, Marvin Lewis has been the head coach of the organization. And, there's a lot of critics of Marvin like Brown here in the city. But, when you look at where the Bengals were in the 12 years without Marvin Lewis and Mike Brown as the owner, and where they're at today, I mean, remarkably, Lewis, the second tenured coach in the NFL right now, right behind Bill Belichick. And since his arrival here in 2004, the Bengals have only had 2 losing seasons. One of those seasons had a lot to do with the fact they lost their starting quarterback Carson Palmer early on, Ryan Fitzpatrick starting as many games as him back in 2008. So, I mean, when you put it into perspective and look at the NFL, I mean, yeah, the playoff wins haven't come, and we'll get, we can speculate on those reasons, looking at those individually. But at the end of the day, I mean, the tenure of what they've been able to accomplish, I mean, there's no doubt the franchise has come a long way. What's really happened in the last 5-6 years, really since the Chad Johnson days here in Cincinnati, the fallout there, that was when Marvin Lewis, renegotiating his contract at the time, basically said, hey, I'm going to have control of these decisions with player personnel specifically. And it's shown. It's shown in the draft. I mean, there's no doubt about Marvin Lewis's ability to orchestrate talent. I mean, you look back at some of these drafts and the successes.
Isn't it amazing? I mean, it's truly amazing.
Yeah, and when he first got here, they would take their chances on guys like Chris Henry and Odell Thurman. Yeah, they're great talents. There's a reason they fall to the 3rd round and in the 5th round where you're plucking these guys. It's not been the case anymore. Now, where Marvin Lewis has certainly struggled, and his staff as well, is the game planning and more specifically the game adjustments made, clock management, issues like that you go up against a Patriots team often overmatched. And I think that's led to a lot of their playoff troubles because when you get there, you're facing the best of the best. Now, that said, this year, I mean, I'm not here to be an apologist, but you're looking at a Bengals team that finished at 10-5-1, despite losing their wide receiver 2 before the season ever began, Marvin Jones, their former first-round pick and a tight end that many speculated last offseason was due for a breakout, Tyler Eifert, just 10 offensive plays into the season, and then played in a playoff game without the benefit of A.J. Green, perhaps their best wide receiver in the league, as well as their starting tight end, Jermaine Gresham. So I don't know if I'm ready to sit here and say that, you can really blame the playoff loss on Andy Dalton and Marvin Lewis this year. I think, the cards were sort of stacked against them. The fact the Bengals lost all that in their offense, became only the second team in over 2 decades to lose both of their offensive coordinators without the benefit of winning a Super Bowl to head coaching jobs, and Mike Zimmer going to Minnesota, as well as Jay Gruden. Jay Gruden ended up in D.C. And, so I think you look at what they accomplished last season in particular, given all those hurdles. I thought it was a pretty successful campaign. I know a lot of Bengals fans didn't like the way it ended.
Well, and I guess I can't blame them there, but you've highlighted a lot of the things that last season were sort of undercurrents as to sort of their overall play, and despite it, they make the playoffs and they actually end up having a winning record and just doing well, which, there's 32 teams in the league. For the kind of consistency that they've had under Marvin Lewis, it's pretty damn incredible. I wanted to ask you if you have any impressions about Marvin Lewis' drafting style, and I'll tell you why. Every year I keep track of all the picks, and then I go back and I actually try and figure out whether or not teams have reached for picks or got great deals. And generally speaking, the Bengals pick players where they're supposed to, or when players fall in the draft, they're not scared to sort of say, hey, we didn't think this player would be here, but we're going to go get him now.
Well, the Bengals have been in a very fortunate position, and I think they're there again this year, to where they're approaching the draft from a position of luxury in the sense that they don't have to necessarily go and get that certain position. And when you're picking in where you look at 4 straight, as you said, playoff appearance seasons, that means you're picking in that latter half of the draft. And when you get into to those types of scenarios, that's when you really start looking at, hey, we're able to take the best player on the board. I mean, you look at Tyler Eifert, probably wasn't a guy there, but the Bengals were able to say, hey, we need this difference maker at tight end. Now, of course, injuries have derailed both of his first 2 seasons, but nonetheless, I mean, they've been able to do that. And I think with Marvin Lewis in particularly too, they really have had a good ability to find those late round gems. Vontaze Burfict, another one of these guys. Yeah, he had a little bit of a checkered past, but they got him for next to nothing there at the end of the draft. And last year, another player riddled by injury, but 2 years ago, I mean, he was probably one of the best defensive playmakers in the AFC. So overall, the draft I don't think has been the issue with Lewis. I would go as far to say that I believe that in recent years, I would put them up really against a lot of the teams out there with the thing. I mean, you go back to his early days. I mean, the first round picks, Carson Palmer was his very first pick. The following year, probably one of his worst picks with Chris Perry, traded down 2 picks. Could have had Steven Jackson, went with their guy. Perry was a bust. David Pollock, I think that guy was all world. Of course, he had the career-ending neck injury there. Leon Hall, Keith Rivers. So Andre Smith, these are all years where I still believe Mike Brown was having more of an influence. But in the last 4 to 5 years, what they've done with players like A.J. Green in round 1, Andy Dalton in the second round there, Dre Kirkpatrick, he was the 2012 first-round pick. Not the best lands there, but they went ahead and got Kevin Zeitler, who's been a nice contributor on the offensive line later in the first round. Mohamed Sanu came that year in the 3rd round. Giovanni Bernard, I think, was a nice second-round pick. So the jury's still out on some of these more recent years, but I challenge you to look really at any NFL franchise. And you said you do study them, so you already know what I'm going to say. And the fact that, hey, man, you could look at any team in the first 3-4 rounds of their drafts over the last 5-6 years, and you're going to find a fair share of booms, and busts, but you're also going to find some nice value. And I think the Bengals have certainly been in the upper echelon. I think that's reflective in their playoff run and their recent success.
You had mentioned earlier a couple names we haven't heard in quite a few years, like Carson Palmer, Chad Ochocinco. You could have thrown in T.J. Houshmandzadeh, one of my favorite players. Cedric Benson, I can't recall if he was there with those guys sort of at the end or if it was totally afterwards, but whatever the case, you look back and you sort of see that era in Bengals football. And then you look at this one with Andy Dalton, with A.J. Green, with the double running backs they have now, in Gio Bernard and why am I having a blonde moment?
Jeremy Hill.
Thank you very much. See, that's why I brought you on the show, to just refresh my memory. But you compare these two eras, and I can't say it like Andy Dalton is no Carson Palmer. I thought Carson Palmer, and I still do think that he's an exceptional quarterback. And I guess what's missing? What is sort of the thing that the Bengals can't capture to get themselves deeper into the playoffs and even into the AFC Championship?
Well, I think we've seen a couple things here. I mean, one, you look back at the Bengals of yesteryear. I mean, I think the game has changed a little bit. I mean, you get into the playoffs now, and yeah, I think that pound and ground has been a philosophy that was some old school stuff. But I mean, you got to score to win a playoff game in the NFL. If you're not putting up 30 points, chances are you're not going to win.
Yep.
I mean, that's the reality of the league. Now, that said, I mean, I think some of those Bengal teams, the year Palmer got hurt against the Steelers in the very first quarter of their playoff game, and the Steelers went on to win the Super Bowl. I mean, that was devastating. I think that offense, from a passing perspective, before Palmer's knee injury, before his shoulder troubles, with Chad Johnson in his prime, and obviously they had Chris Henry on that team. I think he was a troubled player, but one of the best talents, pure speed guys in the league, and you could put that out on the field. And today, rest assured, I mean, this team is going back to wanting to do it with their defense, with their running. Jay Gruden was here, and you look at those playoff losses. I mean, 2 years ago, Andy Dalton had 55 attempts, and Jay Gruden's departure, his getting that job with the Redskins, that was the best thing that happened to the Bengals in the offseason, because they put a guy that better suited for Marvin Lewis's style football, Hugh Jackson, in there. And as I said, Hugh Jackson had all these game plans coming into the season, but you lose your wide receiver 2 for the entire season. Basically, your tight end 1 for the entire season. So they had blows right out of the gate. I thought Tyler Eifert was going to have a breakout season. I'm still optimistic. Obviously, every year that it doesn't happen, I get a little bit more worried there. Marvin Jones, I can tell you right now, talking to guys, the buddies of mine that cover this team on a daily basis, is looking extremely good right now. I'm expecting a nice bounce back there. But this team's going to run the football. They ran the football for the most times in Marvin Lewis's head coaching era last year, over almost 50% of the plays. And Jeremy Hill is that guy, the downhill runner. They've got an above-average offensive line that I think will improve still this offseason with more talent in it. And then Giovanni Bernard in open space, a guy that as a nice compliment to Jeremy Hill. They don't need Andy Dalton to win them football games. They need Andy Dalton to not lose them football games. And taking care of the football will be top priority for a guy that spent 17 interceptions last season. That's huge. Dalton's still just 27, though. So, I mean, there is some room for some upside. I mean, the guy's never going to be Peyton Manning. But I guarantee you this, there's a lot of football teams out there that would really like to have him under center. I mean, 23-1 in his career. He's led the team to 4 consecutive playoff appearances, 3 straight double-digit win seasons. To put that in perspective, before Dalton arrived in 2011, the Bengals, who were originated in 1968, have never made 4 straight playoff appearances. Before his team arrived, this team had never won 10 more games in 3 straight years. And you have to go back to count the 1988 season to even come up with 3 10-win seasons between 1988 and 2011 for Andy Dalton. So, yeah, they're a little critical of him here after these playoff losses. I mean, the guy can't even go to the grocery store around town at that time.
What, are you chasing him?
There's a lot of uneducated Bengal fans that were just totally ticked off when the Bengals gave him this huge contract last offseason. But a closer look at it is really all they gave him was 1 more year this year. And it's a nice price tag. He still won't be in the top 10 paid quarterbacks in the league this season. And after this year, the Bengals could cut him with less than a $2 million cap hit. So I don't think it was a big thing to re-sign him. They didn't have anything waiting in the wings. Yeah, everybody wants the next Andrew Luck. Unfortunately, very few teams get that opportunity. And as you look around the league, Look around and find quarterbacks that have led their team to the playoffs 4 times, much less their first 4 years as a pro.
Dan, you're absolutely right as rain, and I'm looking at some of his numbers. I mean, he's generally speaking a 65% completion quarterback. But for this past season, he can easily throw for over 4,000 yards, 30-plus TDs. And it sounds like what you're saying, what sort of the Bengals are missing, if it wasn't for maybe some misdirection in coaching under the philosophy of Jay Gruden, injuries, things that are happening around them that they just have no control over.
Every team has injuries problems, Jim. Every team. And here's the thing. I mean, at the end of the day, I don't care if you're a football coach in the NFL, a CEO of a company, or just running your own business, whatever. I mean, bottom line is you have to know your personnel, what their strengths and weaknesses are, and then how to maximize their potential. And yes, I'm very much saying I don't think Jay Gruden is that guy. I don't think he was that guy here. I think he's going to be a disaster, especially handcuffed with the RG3 scenario up there in D.C. No longer our problem, though. He can continue to live off his brother's name all he wants. But Hugh Jackson is the guy that I believe is a better fit for this offense. I think a full year here with both these running backs now under the belt, even less of Andy Dalton, an improved defense. I mean, losing Mike Zimmer was a big blow. There's a lot of people that would prefer the Bengals to promote Marvin Lewis to a vice president, GM almost type of role, and promoted Zimmer to head coach to retain him. That did not happen. And that defense, it took a little bit of a hit, lost a little bit of its edge. The Bengals aren't busy this year in free agency. They're never busy in free agency. But you know what? More often than not, that's suited them well. They actually were given a 3rd and 4th round pick, compensatory picks for losing out on free agents a year ago. Michael Johnson to Tampa Bay and Anthony Collins, the offensive tackle, to the Bucs. They've already re-signed Johnson. They're getting ready to re-sign Collins. So now they got these guys back. They traded Carson Palmer a couple years ago to the Raiders, where Hugh Jackson was the head coach. The pick they got back there, they used to draft Gio Bernard. So it's like these guys are leaving and they're coming back home. And add to that, I think one of the more quiet off-season signings, and it's a pretty bold statement, but I believe that getting Denarius Moore for next to nothing, a very young and still very quick Denarius Moore. Denarius Moore was pretty much been non-existent in Oakland except for that one season. Guess who the head coach was that one season? Hugh Jackson. So I look for him to compete for the 3rd or 4th receiver role behind Mohamed Sanu, behind Marvin Jones, behind Chad Johnson, and come draft at the end of the month. I mean, the Bengals, they could go all offensive line, get a guy like Anders Pete from Stanford. Maybe they look at defensive line, a very deep, a lot of defensive tackles that are difference makers could be available there. With that 21st pick, I really like Malcolm Brown out of Texas. I think he could be a good fit. Some around here in the Buckeye State are hoping they maybe grab one of those Ohio State Buckeyes, and especially if they go receivers with Devin Smith. I don't know if they'll go that route. The reality of it is I look for them to have more pass rushers, but they can do whatever they want because they don't have that real position of desperate need. They just need a really overall depth.
Dan, you're reading my mind. Every time I'm thinking of a question, you're answering it. So as long as you're feeling very clairvoyant tonight, or you appear to be very clairvoyant, before we get to some of your fantasy thoughts, look into your crystal ball. What do you think about the Bengals in 2015? If you had to it's a guess. I mean, nobody really knows what's going to happen until it happens, but you can look at a team and kind of see you like them, you don't like them. Is this a Bengals team that finishes better than 8-8 or possibly less than 8-8?
Well, I don't really see them finishing too far under 8-8. A lot of it will come down to health, as with every team. As I look at the opponents, the AFC North this year matched up with the NFC West, so that's not great. I really think that's one of the worst interconference matchups we could get on the slate there. Add to it, some tough away games. They have to make the trip to Buffalo this year, the trip to Denver. I think those are going to be really 2 tough ones there. They do get the Chiefs and the Texans and the Chargers at home, but any one of those teams are capable. So, I mean, given what they've done in recent years, I would say health aside, you're looking at a team that absolutely I would take over 8, but I think maybe their ceiling could be 10 wins once again with this tough schedule. A lot of it's going to depend on the division because those are 6 of the games. Cleveland's the worst team in football. And you look at Pittsburgh just continuing to get old. Their defense is a shell of its former self, but they still have some offensive weapons. Without Le'Veon Bell for 3 games, going to be a tough start to the season there. And the Ravens, I think, you talk about the Bengals really not doing anything in this offseason. At least the Bengals didn't have a ton of key losses. The Ravens did equally as little in the offseason and had some magnificent losses. So, you're losing Torrey Smith, losing Nada on the defensive line there. I mean, just 2 of the losses that the Ravens suffered. I mean, I think that the Bengals, if they're going to have a lot of double-digit win season, it's going to come because they're sort of cleaning things up in the AFC North. However, if there's never an easy game in the AFC North, so a 500 finish there probably puts them close to 500 for the season.
Dan, we're just about at the end of this segment, and before we get to our first break of the night, I've sharpened my pencil. I got a fresh notebook out, and I want to get your insight into fantasy football. It's usually what I talk with you about on a couple Sundays a year on your radio show on Fox. Who is a player that you see experiencing an uptick in production? Not necessarily on the Bengals. You can talk about anybody you want, but who do you see as somebody that, compared to last year, this guy's just bound to have a better season?
Well, I mean, a better season is a tough one, but I will tell you one of the guys I'm most enamored with this entire offseason is at quarterback, and I think that's where the landscape is changing the most, Jim. And Russell Wilson's that guy for me. I look at quarterback, and 1 and 1A tier is Aaron Rodgers and Andrew Luck, and I think that gap between what comes next is huge. Peyton Manning, Drew Brees are part of that. I think those guys are on the decline, particularly Manning with his health, Brees, the change of offense there, the loss of Jimmy Graham. So, who is number 3? Who is the top of tier number 2? Obviously, a lot of owners waiting on quarterbacks out there, but given what Russell Wilson can do on the ground, given the addition of Jimmy Graham, Lynch is still there to take touchdowns. Russell Wilson's my number 3 fantasy quarterback this season. And I really believe Russell Wilson will be a guy that will slip in the rounds 5, 6, and 7 in a lot of drafts and end up leading owners to championships.
Wow, that is a deep prognostication right there. I mean, I love the offseason that the Seahawks have had, and with Jimmy Graham, this is an offense that should, at least on paper, just be unstoppable because there's just not going to be enough guys on a defense to double team the guys you need to double team.
Yeah, the re-signing of Lynch was big, but those rushing yards had a big component to it. Plus, I do think, in addition to that they're not done. I look for Seattle to definitely add another early round option in that passing game. So it's going to be an exciting year, but it's not as much just all in Russell Wilson what I like, but you look at the other quarterbacks. Who is number 3? I mean, Peyton Manning, a lot of people say it, but I'm sorry, man. I just, after watching him down the stretch, I don't have confidence that he's going to be there for me come playoff time, and that's when the cash is won.
Yeah, you and Keith should spend some time talking about that because that's been his modus operandi since middle of last season to the present day. But that's for another show.
Yes.
Let me ask you this one. Who's a player, downturn in production, maybe a guy that you're kind of going, man, I just don't like how things are shaping up for him for 2015?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of guys that I'm sort of fizzling on in that regard.
Yeah.
I'll tell you one big name player that sort of comes to mind for me, and that is Le'Veon Bell. And I mean,
really?
This is a guy that hands down would be the number 1 guy on my board, if not for this 3-game suspension he's facing. And if that suspension holds true, from a fantasy perspective, you got to factor a bye week in there as well. You're talking about a guy that's going to miss 4 weeks most of us play 13-week seasons. Can you really invest a top 3 to 4 or 5 pick on him? I can't.
Yeah, that's true.
I can't do it, man. I can't take a guy that is going to miss a third of my season eventually I would. Chances are others will take him before me. So if you're talking about a guy that stock is taking a big hit this offseason, I struggle to find a running back that's taken a bigger hit than he with that big suspension handed down earlier in the month.
Well, Dan, I got to tell you, that's some great advice, and for all our listeners out there, I want to thank you for coming on the show again. It's been way too long. I'll look forward to getting you back on later on, and hopefully you'll be kind enough to have me back on your show.
Oh, absolutely, man. We'll be talking to each other on both places, I'm sure. I'm sure we'll be getting some mock drafts ripping here as we get closer and all the good stuff. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
You always do a great job there at the site, and definitely nice working with Keith tonight. You guys enjoy the drafts coming up here in a couple weeks.
Absolutely. And Dan, before we let you go, tell the listeners how they could connect with you on social media.
Yeah, definitely. At Dan Claskins on Twitter. That's CLASGENS. You can also hit us up, Get Sports Info. I put a lot of my football takes up there, including my rankings up there right now.
Ooh.
But we certainly, like I said, certainly appreciate the time, and we will talk again later in the off season, man.
All right, Dan, thanks so much. And just a reminder to our listeners out there that if you have a question, please call in at 585-633-7487. That's 585-633-7487. Or tweet the Greek at hashtag AskTFG. That's hashtag AskTFG. Don't be shy. Let's take a break.